You're listening to IAM Pulse, a podcast discussing all things identity access management, from defending against cyber attacks and to enhancing your overall cybersecurity strategy. This podcast is brought to you by Biokey International, an innovative provider of flexible, secure access management and biometric identity solutions. We're sitting down to talk about the impact of identity access management makes on you and your business. On this episode of IAM Pulse, we presented to the Independent Community Bankers of America to discuss the growing threats of phishing and ransomware threats against community banks. This episode, Don't Be Held Hostage, Stop Phishing and Ransomware with Biometrics, is presented by our VP of Product, Kim Johnson, and our CLO, Jim Sullivan. I'll turn it over to them.
Great. So excited to have everybody join us today. Have a great presentation lined up for you. Right before turning it over to my speaker for today and introducing him, wanted to do just a quick introduction of Biokey, just for everybody on the line. So we're Biokey International, publicly traded company that provides identity and access management, or what we call IAM, that is powered by Biometrics, and we offer flexible options for multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, self-service password reset, and more. At Biokey, we really focus on securing the connections between people and the systems they use to get things done. And with our Portalguard IDaaS platform, we really focus on putting you back in control of your security and your IAM, including getting a handle on today's webinar topic, which is authentication. We've been in business for over 2 decades with our expertise in both IAM and biometric identity. And we have customers spanning across multiple industries, including many in the financial and banking sector, with some notable names listed here, including World Bank and MasterCard. Most of our customer relationships we're also happy to have lasting for decades over most of our company's history. Now I'll introduce our presenter for today, Jim Sullivan. Jim is Biokey's Senior Vice President of Strategy and Compliance, as well as our Chief Legal Officer. Jim is a recognized expert and frequent speaker on biometric identity, privacy laws, and security for enterprise and consumer applications. In over 17 years at Biokey, Jim has worked directly with dozens of Biokey's household name customers on large-scale, biometric-centered identity management projects that interface daily with millions of corporate and consumer users. Jim has 30 years of experience in IT projects and implementation, 20 of them directly working with identity management solutions at Biokey, Computer Associates, Platinum Technology, and Memco Software. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Jim?
Great. Thanks, Kim. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're really focused on the fact that in the current climate, there is a tremendous focus on how much security you're able to put in place for your internal users, your third-party contractors, and your customers. And as you know, cybersecurity awareness is kind of the mental aspect of this. That's where you're teaching people to be careful not to fall for phishing attacks. You do third-party risk management, which is really the element of reaching out to your supply chain and your partners and making sure that they're not exposing you. But what we're really focused on today is, this element of what you're doing internally, and as you allow people to have access to your sensitive data with implementing identity and access management technologies like multi-factor authentication and single sign-on to make sure that your employees and your customers are able to have the balance between a really secure experience for how they access your systems, but also something that allows them to have the convenience to where they welcome the experience of accessing your systems. So I always use the analogy of when you see Touch ID being offered by an application on your phone, there's kind of a sense of relief. Oh, goodness, I'm so glad I don't have to remember what my password is. We all realize that passwords have tremendous shortcomings, but there are ways that you can make it more secure, but not necessarily make life harder for your end users. So hopefully all of you are either in the process or having implemented multi-factor authentication, and we really see that there's kind of a timeline or a life cycle of evolution around multi-factor technology. The way a lot of us originally encountered it was maybe for remote access to a VPN if you were traveling, and that was limited to those people that were traveling, first of all, but second of all, those that were maybe more familiar with IT technology and therefore were getting more of the keys to the kingdom. And as we started to see MFA bridging into the everyday user who might have historically used a password and username to sign in, we're starting to see the cracks, if you will, which is that there's issues with when you have too much friction in your processes, you've added too many layers of access control, that users will either circumvent it or they'll be somewhat careless in their use of it. And we really see that evolution is bringing to light some of the cracks that maybe are your own experience, you've seen them. The bottom line is that mainstream multi-factor authentication is starting to show those cracks, and it's starting to fail for us. So where's the evidence of that? Well, first, we know that there's just seemingly daily breaches being announced. The fact is that the FBI back in 2019 was warning the industry through what they call a private industry notice that MFA, as it was traditionally being implemented using phones or other second factors, was routinely being circumvented by committed attackers. They specifically called out the fact that through social engineering or phishing and man-in-the-middle attacks that they were able to get access, and hackers were essentially defeating the multi-factor approaches. They recommended, obviously, that there be some education, the social element that I talked about, of encouraging users to be more vigilant and watch for phishing emails and know that no one will ever send you a request for your password seeming to be the IT desk. But at the same time, they also said that there was really a need to implement biometric factors, which is, goes back to Biokey's history of spending so much time in delivering a biometric solution. So we really saw that as kind of the bellwether to where suddenly MFA mainstream was being shown to have some flaws, and that biometrics was the way the FBI at least was recommending that enterprises be addressing that. You may have seen the recent story that for $16, someone was able to take over someone else's SMS account using straight-ahead online tools, which then let them intercept the SMS second factor requests. We know about SIM swapping, where people are able to go in and take over someone else's phone number account, get a SIM on their own phone, and be able to use it to receive those out-of-band authentication. So the fact is that despite the fact that there's a great awareness of the need for multi-factor, when you take what I'll call the easy approach of using a phone as a second factor, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that are now being exploited by the hackers using these second factors. And even though we see that the best practices are well known out there, even the most secure enterprises are reporting that they've been breached, whether it's SolarWinds or Flagstar or Shell Oil. The fact is that there's something wrong when you've got people that are conscious of security still being hacked. So what are the issues? The first thing is that whenever you have a second factor that involves someone having to use their phone, there's a couple of different things that come into play. First, you're dealing with a customer, you're trying to sign into a computer. Suddenly you've got to pull your phone out to get a password. There's a cumbersome, what I call fumble and bumble element to that really people don't want to be interfered with. The second thing is that if you are dealing with someone who is maybe not using their phone on the floor, how are you going to allow them to get in without having them have to go get their phone? So is there an option available in the products you're using to not have to use the phone and not go so far as to calling help desk to get a password, one-time password code? And then the remote access scenarios where you've got people working remotely, whether it's partners or employees, is bringing into the possibility that someone may have a different user actually accessing an account by simply giving them the access to the phone or passing the SMS code over to them. That we call that unauthorized delegation or account sharing. But you see it a lot in third-party contractors where there's essentially one account that's supposed to be used by a background-checked employee, and maybe they've got 2 or 3 different people that are sharing that account to manage your systems. So, that issue of not necessarily authenticating the exact user, but instead authenticating a phone, it has a lot of weaknesses to it. The other component of it is that you deal with some unexpected costs of ownership. So if you're dealing with hardware tokens, which is the kind of mainstream approach right now, and you're sending out tokens to users, you've still got to buy multiple tokens per user so that they can replace them if they lose one. And second of all, if you are having to even ship those tokens and make sure they receive them, there may be an additional cost just in getting a token into every user's hands. So we're looking at the token as being a very expensive solution, which still has the lack of really authenticating a user. But also, we're now starting to see in California and other states that if you're using your phone or an employee's phone, that there may be a liability of having to actually compensate them for their phone usage, whether it's paying for a piece of their data plan or a piece of their phone. Even if their costs aren't increased by your use of that device, California labor law is indicating that you need to be compensating them for the use of their phone. So some of the solutions that may even appear to be free are suddenly having costs to them. And I think, the bottom line is that you can't have one method that meets every situation. So while it may be convenient to have your customers using some strong authentication, it's difficult to send them a token. You have tellers that maybe don't want to have using phones that are dealing with customers, and you have, obviously remote workers like we talked about, where they could delegate that authority you've given to them. So when we see these kinds of varied scenarios and the need for flexibility, this is really what we've sought to meet with our product line, and a way to be able to give you, simple steps that you can do that allow you to have a great MFA experience that your users will love, but also is flexible enough so that you can now allow them to choose from among the various secure options that we support in our product to allow you to be able to say to them, yes, you can use that. If they ask you about, can I use my phone? Yes, you can. However, you don't have to use your phone, so now you start to at least offer them an alternative option so that you don't have to necessarily compensate them for the phone use. It's a convenience for them as opposed to a requirement for you as an employer. So the customers that are coming in online, they're using their own phone. They're customers. They can use that. In branch operations, you may want to have a mix of biometrics and tokens because in branch you're roaming around amongst different workstations, and you want to be able to touch any workstation attached fingerprint scanner and be able to sign in without having to go and fetch your phone or use a token. And that ease of confirmation of identity makes it easier for the users as well. So we'll talk about that. And then obviously for remote access, you can allow someone to have access, but with a biometric, you can enforce that it's actually the individual that you've enrolled as opposed to someone that they've decided to delegate their access to. And again, this is sometimes something people don't realize, that unauthorized delegation is very difficult to stop if you aren't using biometrics because, of course, you have the possible conspiratorial component of someone cooperating where they're handing off their authentication. So the second component is that you want to have advanced authentication approaches. What that means is essentially you don't want to simply rely on the idea that someone has got the right credential, whether it's a token or a phone app. You want to also look at the context of their access. So a product should support the ability to be able to tell that a user is coming in from a particular area of the world, maybe even a restricted set of IP addresses, their home IP, for example, that they're also coming in at an expected point in time, and that they're not logged into two geographically impossible places at once. So that you have that second level analysis that says, does this make sense, what we're seeing happen with that particular user? And then the ability to do step-up authentication really gets to the idea that I want to be able to not just rely on the original Windows sign-in or some first-level authentication that the user does, but maybe for a particular transaction of significance, do another level of authentication just to make sure that it's still them and that we have direct accountability so that, again, somebody hasn't stepped into someone else's workstation and starts to conduct transactions under their account. And then having it be passwordless is really, that's kind of where both sides win, right? The employee wins because they're no longer having to remember and change and manage a complex set of passwords for lots of different applications, but also the fact that you are now you're raising the bar so that you're no longer relying on something that's purely knowledge-based. I always tell people that, the cost of entry for a hacker who has your password is a keyboard and an internet connection. That's all they need to be able to be you. Whereas if you're starting to use these higher level authentication approaches, even a phone or a token or a biometric, you've now raised the stakes so that even if someone is able to obtain the password, for example, they don't have the phone that's the authorized credential, or they don't have the token. So again, you'll see that what we are offering is the ability to let you choose from all of the different factors and apply the ones that make the most sense for your situation. So we talked a little bit about biometrics, and this slide, I hope you can read it, and we're happy to share the deck as was announced at the beginning. But this is two graphics that came from Raconteur, an independent survey they did of corporate IT users to assess their receptiveness to biometrics. And what you see in the top chart is essentially for different categories of authentication, the leftmost being username and password, PIN numbers, mobile device authentication, using your PC as the original authenticator, thumbprint, which is the biometric that we talk about, hardware security tokens, emailing you an OTP, or using SMS. The various color boxes shows the density of responses where the bottom is the most secure. So very secure is the second to the bottom, and then completely secure is the bottommost. And what's interesting is from a user perspective, they believe that biometrics is the most secure. In fact, 43% say it's completely secure as a way of authenticating access. So when you start thinking about putting this in front of users and customers, a biometric gives them the highest bar to be able to say that they really believe that you're now making that account sticky to them and not to someone that could possibly hack their password or get their credential in another way. And then the next graphic really just shows the fact that the reasons that people prefer biometrics, which is an interesting element because so often when you bring security into the situation, the users kind of groan, right? They're being told, okay, we're going to add security. That means you're going to make my life harder. You've added friction to how I have to get things done. I have to sign in with two-level authentication. In the biometric realm, you actually see this kind of paradox where it's 44% saying that they believe it's faster to get in and more convenient, another 44%, whereas the more secure element takes the third position as to why they like biometrics. So, from an IT point of view, biometrics is one of those rare cases where you actually get to make life easier for your end users while you're enhancing security and meeting your compliance goals because you've raised authentication to the highest level of who you are, but you're actually making your end users happy because all they have to do is be who they are and not know something, carry something, or otherwise. So, that kind of brings us to one of the key elements. Having convenience is the key to making security really a win-win for your end users, because if they see that security is doing something to make life easier, namely, I sign in and I get to all of my applications. I navigate to another application and it either has me sign in the same way with my credential I'm already using, or it uses SAML or other federated approaches to keep me signed in as I move from application to application. Having that ability, which is built into our product, allows you to make it so for an end user, this step up in security is now well received as opposed to being something that's more user frustration. They have to call help desk. They're having to get a new token shipped out to them or so on. So having the ability to really deliver convenience at the same time as security is one of those rare opportunities, like I said, and this is where we really think there's a difference to be made because as you can see in this graphic, when you put up barriers, what do the people do? They just go around them and they'll find ways to either write down passwords, leave a token in a machine so that the next person just uses the same one. The kinds of circumvention is always there with some rationality around why they've done it. And we believe that with a biometric, you take away all of the excuses because it couldn't be any easier for them. And it's important that you support lots of ways to sign in, but that you have among them the biometrics, so you have that carrot element to make sure that people are happy about the process. So just talking a little bit about kind of how Portalguard delivers this, right? You have the biometric or the other factors that we support. That's how you prove who you are. But then once you're in, you're now able to get through single sign-on to many different applications so that you have a suite of applications that each of your users is relying on to get their job done. And you have your own set of online applications that your customers use to be able to get to your banking services. Our product is made to serve both communities so that you can actually set it up either in the cloud, as you see on the left, where we're hosting it, or you can have it in a private cloud where you host it and it's ready to roll right into Amazon or Azure Web Services, or you can run it on-prem if your operations are on-premise. So you're able to run the same solution in both environments and deliver the ability to be able to add the strong authentication with single sign-on to get to all the destination applications you need, and features like self-service password reset, which, for all of its simplicity, it's such an important capability to not have to have people making either cumbersome phone calls or having to go through help desk to get a password reset. We allow you to be able to have self-service password reset right at the front level for the end user to be able to use and access and manage themselves. And it'll take care of the process that you dictate through our product to be able to say that you want to have them receive an email, you want to have them do a second factor authentication. You can control what that workflow is, but it allows you to then let them self-service a reset of a password that might have otherwise required a help desk call. And what you'll see is that we support a lot of different authentication factors. So where we talk about the strengths and weaknesses of phones or tokens, we support them, but we give you the ability to also choose to use the fingerprint scanner approach with even our own line of fingerprint scanners that you can use so that you can provide that better user alternative for those shared workstations and be able to simply plug in a fingerprint scanner and have that scanner sit there and the authentication takes place with each user that visits that workstation instead of, again, having them each have to carry something. So depending on your scenarios, this is a very elegant solution for people that roam around because, again, you don't want to have each and every user carry something to be able to sign into each and every workstation as opposed to having the workstation simply recognize those users with the biometric where that makes sense. So when you compare Portalguard with the alternatives, and the alternatives range from everything to I'm rolling my own, which we actually had AT&T, our customer, rolled their own multi-factor authentication. And then when they saw our technology, they actually licensed it and incorporated it into their own multi-factor stack. Or it could be that you've got an existing multi-factor approach that isn't meeting all of the needs of your applications. Maybe it doesn't provide the convenient form factor for authenticating for a remote user without having to get them a token, or maybe it's too reliant on the phone. So we see ourselves really as different because we're trying to say yes to every alternative that you might already be using, but give you the flexibility to be able to say that where it makes sense, some of these richer set of authentication approaches can give you choices to be able to make applications really work for your end users instead of it being that high friction environment. So it says here we support 15 authentication methods. That means that if you're using FIDO tokens, then we support FIDO tokens so they can be a first-class authenticator for us. If you're using Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, those are applications on your phone that our software can interface with. If you're using an OTP sent to a RSA Secure ID, we support those types of tokens or phone-based tokens. Likewise, if you want something that is biometric, we have our own biometric support, but we also support things like the built-in FIDO Windows Hello capabilities that are in some of the laptops now. So we give you the choice with the Biokey biometric, which is, just to distinguish it, is a real biometric capability where you're actually matching back on a server to know that it's the particular user and not just the phone that the user's Touch ID is working with. Because again, if it's your employee, you may want to make sure that an employee doesn't have to have their phone, and therefore they can simply walk over and touch a fingerprint scanner and have that ability to match it centrally so that in your software, you're confirming the identity as opposed to requiring that they carry something. It works with desktop login so that you have the ability to tie this into how you sign into Active Directory in Windows, so that first level startup of a workstation is also able to use that same multi-factor authentication approach. And we have a lot of customers now that are putting this out as kind of the front guardian gate to their own web properties, as I mentioned, so that their customers coming in are being authenticated using one or more of the factors that we support, so that a customer can choose to use Google Authenticator or may use a FIDO token or may use their biometric. And the beauty is that you're given the choice to be able to accept all of the different authentication factors that are out there instead of having to say, no, you've got to use this particular approach because we can't support more than one or two. So again, it gives you that flexibility. And the thing that we hear from customers is that our pricing model, which really is much more geared towards the idea that we want this to be a no-brainer to deploy to large numbers of users, is really attractive as opposed to some of the what I'll call King's Ransom type of products, which view their multi-factor as something that's very expensive, and for every user every month you're spending a lot of money. So the ability to essentially have one throat to choke, buying your software and having hardware that comes from us is there as an option for you. But really what we see as a strength is that a lot of customers come to us with using some other limiting factor. They're using Duo, for example, and they realizing they need more than just Duo. Our software supports Duo, and it allows you to be able to add additional factors to it. You can say if you have an existing fingerprint reader that you've been using, our software supports 40 different fingerprint scanners so that you don't have to buy all new scanners to be able to continue to use the fingerprint scanners you have, but you'll have our software which works better with it. So we're really trying to give, again, that the emphasis being the choice for you as opposed to having to say we're going to conform your world to our way of doing things. Having more command in your role allows you to be able to give people the choice to kind of win them over, and then you can show them you have other authentication options they can choose from. So again, just reviewing as a quick summary, we see that MFA as a concept is very much taking hold really across enterprises. The fact is, though, that the wrong kind of MFA can really leave you vulnerable and can make it so that end users are dissatisfied with the user experience. So we want to help by essentially allowing you to be able to use more options as far as how you choose to authenticate users, how you connect through federation and single sign-on to the applications you're already using. And for example, if you're using an IAM platform like a CA SiteMinder or an Oracle IDCS or Okta even, our software can actually provide the multi-factor to those platforms so that you can kind of renovate the multi-factor experience without having to necessarily rip and replace all of the existing federation and single sign-on you may have used in the past. So that's something to keep in mind, is that a lot of times people say, well, I've got this big investment in a SiteMinder, for example, or one of these products, but I'm limited in terms of the authentication options. We can actually give you the MFA to essentially slide in there to have a better user experience within the same framework. So, again, it's very compatible and it's kind of grow with you type of approach. And the convenience of these options are really what will win over the end users, because for once in our lives in the world of security, we get to tell them that we're going to make things easier. We're going to make it so that, you're simply touching your finger. And if you've got an app that you're already using on your phone, you can use that. But again, giving them those options and making them a stakeholder in the process is one of the keys. And we believe that having the biometric as kind of the backbone of identity allows you to be able to have a future-proof approach to how you, in the future, for example, will identify users when you're not necessarily face-to-face with them, so that you have the ability to be able to send someone a fingerprint reader or even tell them to buy one online, and they can then authenticate against the enrollment that you did with them years ago and be able to continue to authenticate and know with certainty that it's the same individual. So, that's one of the things that we really believe differentiates our product, because for a lot of companies, biometric means you're using Touch ID, and we really think that that's more authenticating the phone and leaves the end user in too much control over who's authenticated into that phone, versus using our approach of a server biometric as an option allows you to say, I want to have full control of exactly which users, and only those users can access my systems when I authenticate them. So it's really about giving you the choice as far as how those will go. At this point, we'll transition to the questions, and there's a link there that I know Janine will talk about, but we welcome the opportunity to be able to answer some questions for you.
What can Portalguard do to prevent account sharing among remote work contractors?
Yeah, this is kind of what I was starting to allude to, actually, where we've seen, for example, that when you hire an administrator of a particular product and you may, work with them initially very interactively, and then suddenly over time you may see that individual has got a team and they're starting to delegate the tasks that you thought they were always the ones doing. So using a biometric in that scenario allows you to be sure that you've got the specific individual, as opposed to someone who's maybe they've given the credential to and said, do my job for the day. So in a remote work scenario, this isn't always a concern, but if it is a concern, to make sure you have true accountability and no opportunity for delegation or account sharing, especially among third-party contractors, this is how you can accomplish that by using biometric to make sure that individual is exactly who you think they are.
Great. Should we only use biometrics when we have a high security sign-in?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because we with our healthcare customers, a lot of times, just to give a little background, healthcare the original entry for biometrics was around the idea of e-prescribing. When the DEA allowed for e-prescribing, they said, well, you have to do some stronger authentication to write a prescription. So one of the options you can use is biometrics. And, so for a lot of hospitals and health systems, they thought, well, we'll just use the fingerprint sign-in for signing a prescription. But then as the users realized that it was actually easier to sign in with that than to use a password and username to start with, they actually started to demand that they could be using it for their initial sign-in. And so you wound up expanding from where it was theoretically only a step-up authentication to where it was more secure, yes, but it was also easier, so let's make it available everywhere. And, again, that's where we want it to be, that it's a no-brainer to deploy this widely.
Good point. Do you have a solution for customer identification?
We do. Actually, interesting, Capitec Bank in South Africa uses Biokey in order to identify their customers when they come in to their bank branches. And what they've essentially done is in South Africa, they have a national ID system where when banks do the KYC step, they simply capture a fingerprint, send it to the Home Affairs Ministry, who verifies the national identity number belongs to that individual based on the fingerprint. And then they charge a fee for that verification every time they do it. So very quickly, of course, the banks realize that, well, if I'm doing that once, I can then enroll them into my own private biometric system, and then I can verify them with that biometric without having to go back and pay Home Affairs for that verification. So what they do is, essentially manage their own biometric system, and they have, in their case, I think there are about 11 million enrollees now in the Biokey system. And anytime someone walks into a branch, they simply put their finger on a scanner, and it's a positive ID. They now know that it's the same individual they originally enrolled, and they're right on to getting access to the correct account and letting them do what they came in to do. So as opposed to customers having to produce a photo ID or use some kind of a PIN pad, this is an alternative, and it's definitely one that is a very powerful value proposition, and it's a great second stage beyond what you might do for your employees to be able to identify customers in person or online.
Okay, here's an interesting one. We have existing fingerprint scanners, but we don't like the software. Would we need to buy new hardware?
Right. Well, Biokey does make our own fingerprint scanners, but we support the scanners that people have. So as just one example, a company might make fingerprint scanners, and their software is poor, so the experience with the users is you'll hear, we tried fingerprint scanners and we put our fingers on them, it didn't recognize us. But now you've got this investment in your fingerprint scanners. Because the Biokey software works interchangeably among all of these different supported fingerprint scanners, including ones we don't make, our customers can always choose. So they can say, I've got these scanners, I'm going to use them for my existing users, and then as I buy new scanners, I can buy Biokey or anyone else's scanners that are supported. So you can repurpose your investments if you've got fingerprint scanners. And people always say, well, it won't work the same way. The answer is no. The fingerprint scanner is the camera, if you will. And if you're a little older like me, you remember the photo labs that sometimes they were in a mall and it was a great photo lab, and there were other ones that were in a mall parking lot with a 1-hour lab, and they weren't necessarily the best labs. The software is like that photo lab where if you have a good quality capture of a camera and you send it to a quick and dirty lab with bad quality, it'll make a bad photo. And likewise, if you take a bad camera and pass it through a great photo lab, it can't make it better. So we see that a lot of the fingerprint scanners are really good cameras, but the software that they pair with them is not that good. And so it allows you to be able to get a better user experience by putting better software with that same scanner.
How do I control and set the MFA methods for my users?
Well, the typical approach is that it aligns with how you've got them organized as groups in your Active Directory or your directory systems. So we typically will have one or more authentication pathways, if you will, which is to say a group of users is allowed to authenticate with a series or in parallel set of authentication approaches, and then those are set based on those groups or at an individual user level, depending on what you would like. So it always allows you to be able to say that for a particular group of users with maybe more advanced rights, they're actually going to authenticate with maybe a more restrictive, stronger set of options versus the users that you are okay with using something like a phone to be able to simply allow them to get in, but not necessarily have the kind of access that you would worry about for the more restrictive approaches. So it's always flexible, and it allows you to be able to have really an infinite number and variety of pathways that are supported as part of how people authenticate.
Okay. Can we use your software with our bank management platform via SAML?
Yeah, SAML is one of the industry standards for how you authenticate. And the other one you hear a lot about is OpenID Connect. And sometimes you'll hear people talk about OAuth or some of these traditional approaches for how one application can rely on a different system to do its authentication. So we support all three of those, as well as several other standards, so that when a customer's application allows for one of those approaches for delegating authentication to us, then it can be configured without any coding. You simply set it up on both ends to say that application knows that it's to use the Biokey Portalguard, what's called an identity provider, and then it will authenticate for that application, and the application in turn will trust the authentications that come back from it. So it's very graceful in how it interplays between the two products, but most of the online banking software systems can be configured to use either SAML or OpenID Connect or OAuth, and many of the online internally facing banking systems are also configured in that way so that you can mix and match to be able to put our authentication in the right context for your applications.
Thank you, Kim and Jim, for being on the panel today. It's great to hear about solutions to the growing problem of phishing and ransomware, and how flexible Portalguard can be when finding the right solution. This wraps up today's episode of IAM Pulse. Thank you for listening to the show. If you want more information on stopping phishing and ransomware with Biometrics, or learn more about Portalguard, visit our website, www.bio-key.com. Thank you again, and talk to you soon.